It all started with a crash in 1959. But before that, how I built my first Formula Junior car inspired by motor racing around the world. My interest in motor racing went back long before that, to the time when my parents took me to the London Festival in 1951. I was 14 and had eyed a little model racer in a shop window next to our hotel in Russel Square, London. It was powered by a rocket engine and I bought it with my pocket money. However, those model cars were peanuts in comparison with a real car. So in the winter 1957-58, on my way to work on my Lambretta scooter, I was passing a service station every morning, and out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a Morgan Plus 4 1951 parked outside and in a sorry state. One morning, I went in, asked about it, was told that the Swede had left it, never paid for the repair, and that I could have it if I paid for the repair. That's how I got my first car. Later, I drove it to Sweden without a license and sold it with a handsome profit. Now in the money, I bought an old Ford Anglia 1951 in a scrapyard, put it in our garden to my father's despair, stripped the body off the chassis and fitted an Ashley glass fiber sports body imported from England. The result was a pretty sports car that I sold and now had money to go racing. In the meantime, a friend of mine had an old MG TC 1939 which needed complete restoration. So as 17-year-olds, we set out to do just that, and the experience taught me a lot about the mechanics that became in handy later. Now 19-year-old, we decided to build our own Formula Junior car. As the Saloon Car Championship in Denmark 1958 had been won with a Nardi Fiat 1100cc, we bought it to use as a donor car and built our own car during the winter 1958-1959. We fitted the engine, transmission, suspension, electrics, the rack and pinion steering, the wheels, and mounted it all on a light tubular chassis welded together by a flight mechanic that we knew and who also helped us to shape and clad the chassis with an aluminium body. Finally, we fitted the steering wheel and a rev counter and were ready in May 1959 with our Nardi Fiat Formula Junior racing car weighing just 500 kilos. My friend Erik and I had agreed to take the car to the racing track Roskilde Ring, 30 kilometers west of Copenhagen, to test it, and the one of us that did the fastest lap times should drive the car in the first race, the 6th of June 1959. However, building the car all on our own and having no experience in engineering, we had not realized that fitting a suspension made for a car weighing 1100 kilos to a car that weighed 500 kilos, the steering would be very difficult. Come race day, being a fast car and I determined to win, I actually managed to lead into the first long bend, and reaching 130 km, I lost control through the second bend, flipped over and came to a halt with a broken arm, a 7-centimeter hairline crack in my skull and 3 months in hospital. Needless to say, I learned the hard way. Undaunted and determined, having acquired a supercharged Austin Healey Sprite with a special aluminium body and racing it at Roskilde Ring in September 1960, I won the Danish championship for sports cars up to 3000 cc in 1960. That led to a job as reserve driver and mechanic in 1961 with Team Speedwell in England. After a year in England, racing my Team Speedwell Sprite in races among other at Goodwood, I returned to Denmark for the 1962 season as first team driver for the Mini Cooper factory team, in addition to driving my own Lola Formula Junior. Here you see my mechanic friend Torben next to my Lola. In 1963, I swapped the Lola for a Lotus 17 sports racing car, sold that in 1964 while hired as private team driver in a Lotus 18 Formula Junior, and in 1965, realizing that I now had to make a choice between being a full-time racing driver or build a serious business career, I chose the latter and stopped driving round in circles. Still having motor racing in my blood, my first little venture was driving my Mini Cooper 1275cc to a company in England who specialized in converting the Mini in what they called a mini sprint, lowering the roof, fitting doors, bonnet and boot lid in aluminium, and tuning up the engine. I now had a mini sprint and negotiated a dealership from Scandinavia, and it was published in the newspapers and magazines, receiving many inquiries. Meanwhile, I was offered the job as sales promotion and public relations manager at Ford Motor Company in Denmark, and a couple of years later, I started my own design company. But that is another story. We now fast forward to 2002. Having never forgotten my motor racing, I acquired a Jaguar C-Type 1953, being a reconstruction of the original, needing only a light restoration. Having finished my C-Type, I went into partnership with a Riley specialist friend, and from a bare chassis he had, we reconstructed a Riley Big 4 1937, a beautiful car that we sold successfully the day it was ready. While completing that, I had become interested in several old French racing cars from the 30s. The Delahaye Type 135 CS, the Delahaye 7S, the Bugatti Type 135, and the Talbot Lago Type 150 SS. Having found a rare Delahaye Type 168 from 1939 in a forest in Germany, and two Delahayes 1937, but still not one correct to use as a donor car, I finally found a Delahaye chassis Type 138 from 1935, which had the right chassis for what was to become my Delahaye Type 138/135 CS 2 years later. So here follow the story of the reconstruction of my Delahaye. I found the Delahaye hidden away in a garage in Normandy, buried to the roof in plastic sheets and boxes full of dismantled parts, etc. Checking the engine, the chassis number, and the original Delahaye badge, I bought the car on the spot and had it shipped to my Riley friend in Leicester the following week. Meanwhile, I bought the old so-called Delahaye Bible, a 300-page book that included pages of information and pictures about the only four 1935 Delahaye 138 sports racers ever produced, and I luckily found an original factory drawing that became invaluable to my whole reconstruction project. After the car had been shipped to the workshop of my friend, I flew over and immediately stripped the car down to the bare chassis and engine. As the Type 138 saloon car chassis was 3 meter and 15 centimeter long, and the Type 138 sports racer was 2 meter 84 centimeters, I had to shorten the chassis, so I brought it to another friend of mine who cut out 31 centimeters from the middle section and realigned and re-welded the chassis. Now the chassis had the original correct length. I needed to replace the old radiator with a shorter and thicker core in aluminium. And having had that made and fitted above the old oil cooler, it was the turn to replace the old steel plate wheels with wire wheels correct in rim size and number of spokes. That operation proved to be much more complicated than anticipated, as the old wheel hubs were entirely different to the new wire wheel hubs needed in order to accommodate the wire wheels and had to be especially made to order. Still, having succeeded, I now had a ready chassis in dark blue with engine, radiator and wire wheels fitted, so it was time to replace the single Solex carburetor with 3 fitted on double aluminium inlet manifolds. It took me several months to find them among Delahaye owners in France. Having finally succeeded, I had the old exhaust manifold sandblasted and mounted it all to the engine. Having lowered the radiator, the old water pump was sitting much too high on the engine and needed to be replaced. With no spares available, I contacted the network of Delahaye owners again, and one, the old commissioner at the Le Mans, had once 5 lowered water pumps manufactured in aluminium, and luckily had one left that I bought. Then the old dynamo had to be sent away for renovation, and a single radiator fan was replaced with a 6-wing fan. Finally, the original steering wheel of 45 centimeters in diameter had to be replaced with the correct period 1. And I luckily found an original of 43 centimeters in diameter. An important junction had been reached in the reconstruction, as my Delahaye was now ready for making the ash-wood frame necessary to be clad with the aluminium body later. I had been recommended a person in Derby who specialized building ash frames for old cars. It is absolutely vital to build the ash frame to the right measurements, because the proportions and shape of the frame decide the shape of, for example, the height of the frame at the bulkhead in relation to the radiator frame in order to get a pretty slope to the bonnet. I decided on a decline of 1.5 inch mid to front, in addition to making many other calculations, and hope that I got them all right. It was now the turn of making and shaping the instrument panel in aluminium and fitting the 6 period instruments: the rev counter, the speedometer, the water temperature, the oil pressure, the oil temperature, and the amp meter gauges. The car was now ready for the aluminium body to be made and fitted. I was recommended a guy up in Cheshire. I went to see him and brought the car with me. Shaping the aluminium around the ash frame requires great skill, and a beautiful body soon took shape. The way I had designed the rear end, where the spare wheel was to be fitted, the lid was extremely difficult to shape, as it had to slope in all directions in order to appear as part of the body when fitted. Nevertheless, to my great satisfaction, it was successfully crafted and the body was ready. Now I brought the car to a seat maker, and I chose a thick leather in a light Bordeaux color. A spare wheel spinner to hold the spare wheel in place under the boot cover was fitted, and the radiator frame was shortened and re-chromed. Finally, I had designed the wings according to the pictures in the Delahaye book, and got the specialist wingman to make them in aluminium. Fitted, the car now started matching the picture that I had been in my mind all along. The only electric diagram I could find was in the Delahaye book for a Type 148. but as it was from the same period, I gave it to another friend who knew about electrics, and he did a beautiful job fitting all the wires, etc. to the bulkhead, the old re-chromed lights front and rear, and connecting it all to the dynamo and the engine. Last, the aero screens and the side mirrors were fitted, and the car was now ready for painting of the body. I had been recommended a good car painter. He did an excellent job painting it in the blue racing colors of France, and a little toolbox in mahogany were fitted. Finally, the great moment, starting the engine for the first time and test the car. The engine and the sump had been flushed through with a special cleaning fluid, the valves and carburetors adjusted, so holding my breath, turning the key, would it start? Bearing in mind that it had not been started for the best of 70 years, after 4 tries, it fired up to my great relief, and bar some adjustments, it sounded okay. Having started the reconstruction in April 2009, the car was finally finished in July 2011 and registered 860 YUD. I entered the Delahaye in Bonham's September sale 2011, and it was successfully sold to a buyer from California. Shortly after, he entered the car in a major concours competition, and it won first prize. I loved my Delahaye, and I was so proud. You may be thinking, why did I sell the Delahaye if I loved it so much? Well, to tell you the truth, the project had doubled in costs due to all the spare parts needed that had to be handmade. Besides, like painters and sculptors, usually they sell their creation once they have completed it. Likewise, I had no regrets selling my creation. I finally found a complete original 1936 Delahaye Type 135 competition, Coupe des Alpes, that once participated in the Monte Carlo rally, and it needed only a cosmetic restoration. It was a gorgeous car that helped somewhat to balance the budget once it were sold. A Jaguar 3.8 S 1964 were the next project, followed by an Alfa Romeo Spider 2-liter 1974. Those were the last historic cars that I restored, as by now I had reached the ripe old age of 80. I have owned many cars not included in this film, and even if not subject to restoration, I have treated each as if it was my first car, or in this case, my last car. My BMW Coupe 325i from August 1992, and this year has achieved my goal of receiving the Certificato Storica Collezionistica. So I will say farewell with these words. Loyalty to the things we own or love has always been paramount to me.